Welcome. I am Gui Valente, and this is the Valente Brothers podcast. We're back. Pedro Valente.
Happy to be here once again. Thank you very much.
And Joaquim Valente.
Hello, everyone.
So, after a few months, we are returning to our usual podcasts. We're very happy that many of our friends have been requesting us to bring back the episodes. And today we're going to discuss something that actually was suggested by one of our students. Why is it that today BJJ does not have the same success in the UFC, in MMA? Originally, most champions came with a BJJ Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu background. And today it's becoming more and more rare that a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner actually ends up becoming a UFC champion. So I think we can discuss this topic. Pedro, why is that?
We need to look at the history of MMA and the history of the UFC most specifically. The UFC was originally designed to demonstrate the effectiveness of Jiu-Jitsu in a real fight with no rules. That was the reason why the UFC was created, to see which martial art would dominate in a situation where there were no rules. And Royce Gracie won those first UFCs, even though he was the lightest and physically weakest participant, demonstrating that his skills were superior to those other fighters who were champions in other martial arts, karate champions, kickboxing, world champions, wrestling, judo, sambo, all the different styles. Jiu-Jitsu came out on top. But with the UFC, Jiu-Jitsu became extremely popular around the world. And with that popularity, the sport of Jiu-Jitsu became increasingly popular. An international federation was organized and tournaments were promoted. And with that, a specialization in sport jiu-jitsu, which does not allow strikes, and a great evolution, an adaptation for that purpose took place, I should say. And then this specialization took jiu-jitsu further and further away from its original proposition, from the roots of jiu-jitsu, which are for a real fight, where you have striking, where you have grappling, where you fight standing up and you fight on the ground. But sport jiu-jitsu does not include any striking, and the purpose is to score points and not to survive a street confrontation. And since there are strikes in MMA, and also even with the new rules of MMA, it doesn't allow you to stay on the ground too long. Jiu-Jitsu started to not have the same success as it did early on.
So, Joaquim, I believe that today wrestling has surpassed BJJ in terms of the martial art that produced the greatest number of champions of the UFC. Why you believe that wrestling became the number one martial art?
I think that weight divisions is a big reason for that, because wrestling, you have weight divisions, and in the UFC, you have weight divisions. And when you're facing someone who has an equivalent force and size and weight, being able to take that person down, pinning them to the floor, and looking for a position in which you can strike from the ground, right, is of great advantage. And when you say wrestling, I would say most of these wrestlers nowadays have learned submissions, right? So it's important to make that clear. And so they're using their wrestling skills to be able to pin, to be able to take down, to be able to defend takedowns, to be able to keep the fight standing and try to look for the knockout. And when an opportunity shows up, they will use submissions that come from jiu-jitsu that they have learned. I think that it's important to make it clear 2 points that Pedro did. Number one, in relationship to the growth of sport jiu-jitsu in the United States. But it's important to remember that in 1993, the sport of jiu-jitsu was already huge in Brazil. Maybe not as big as today, obviously, but people were practicing. There were tournaments already.
Sure.
And no, because 93 is the year that many people refer to nowadays as old school, right? But they were practicing
Yes.
with strikes. Open hand strikes were part of sparring, which was better for MMA. But there was already an influence of
Big time.
of sport jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
And that influence only grew. And I think that the point that you made was perfect. That nowadays, if you want to be a world champion, and you want to be very good in competition jiu-jitsu, you're practicing reflexes and skills that completely work against you for MMA.
Yes.
Right? And that's where I think there's the biggest disadvantage for BJJ competitors. And I think it's important also to clarify what BJJ means, because many times people, consider what we do as BJJ, and there's a big difference, right?
Well, in that respect, we are Brazilians. We practice jiu-jitsu. Our jiu-jitsu, of course, suffered some adaptations, and there was an influence, a significant influence and contribution by our Brazilian teachers.
Yeah, but today
Grandmaster Hélio.
Yes,
But of course, today
the term
BJJ
Brazilian
is
Jiu-Jitsu
often referred to as
the sport.
the sport. That's very confusing.
Exactly.
However, I think, Joaquim, what you mentioned in the second part of your answer to my question is key, right? The wrestlers learned jiu-jitsu. The kickboxers learned jiu-jitsu, and that's really the biggest difference if you compare it to the first UFCs, and then after a few years. That really changed the landscape. What's very interesting is that, and I believe that's one of the biggest reasons why wrestlers really developed
An advantage.
this predominance, right, is due to the fact that the wrestlers who are specialists in taking their opponents to the ground and pinning them, like you said, they practice jiu-jitsu specifically for MMA, for a fight, right, under the rules of MMA. So they learned the techniques that they needed for that. Even other fighters, a great example of that is Anderson Silva, who you have mentioned as one of the greatest
Jiu-jitsu, one of the fighters who best utilized jiu-jitsu skills
in MMA.
in MMA.
Why? Because Anderson Silva, again, coming from his striking background, he learned actually a lot from one of our friends, right, Cristiano.
Yes.
He learned specifically for
MMA.
MMA.
Correct.
And the same happened with the wrestlers. While the BJJ practitioners, they were developing also what you mentioned, Joaquim. They were, of course, specializing still in the arm locks and the chokes and all the other techniques that can benefit one in a self-defense scenario, in a MMA scenario. But they were developing the reflexes. The evolution, the so-called evolution of jiu-jitsu was a evolution for sport, for the rules of competition, the intricacies, right, the loopholes that you can take advantage of for sport jiu-jitsu within those rules. 2 points for, I think I still remember the rules, 2 points for knee on belly, 3 points for passing the guard, 4 points for mounting or catching someone's back, 2 points for a takedown. I'm not sure if these are still the rules. And right, jiu-jitsu fighters were even, still are, actually now more than ever, they were even giving their backs to not be pinned. So exposing a lot of the holes.
Yes, and that's the thing. In this effort to increase their ability to succeed in tournaments where striking is not allowed, they developed new guards, new forms of using the guard and the half guard. When it comes to practicing jiu-jitsu from the bottom, it changed completely. And these new techniques often ignore strikes completely. And so they expose you tremendously to striking. Techniques like the deep half guard, many different types of guards where your face is completely exposed. How to defend when somebody is in side control with underhooks. Techniques that expose the face to striking. Defense when somebody mounts on top of you, blocking the hip, the face completely exposed.
Go back to the guard, right? What's one of the most important principles that the guard offers us when we have an open guard? What do you need to stop someone from knocking you out? What do you need? Foot on the hip.
Yes.
You need the foot on the hip. At least one foot has to be in your opponent's hip.
Sure.
Because without the foot on the hip, meaning stopping the hip,
creating distance,
the person on top can very quickly knock you out. But in sport jiu-jitsu, we started developing, BJJ practitioners, sport practitioners started developing very well, we might say, for that purpose, all these different hooks and all these different positions, almost fetal positions, right, that completely neglect the possibility that the person on top might punch you in the face. Yeah. So it, like you said, it completely changed the reality of why the guard was first developed.
Another example, the close guard. What do we learn? When somebody stands up and you have your feet crossed, if they're going to pick you up, what do?
You open your legs.
Open your legs. But since in sport jiu-jitsu you're not allowed to slam, people actually let themselves get picked up or they jump guard, right? Exposing you to a knockout, to a slam, which is very dangerous.
What did Elio, I know you want to say something, but very quickly, did you ever learn jumping guard with Elio Gracie?
Never. He had a technique if you wanted to pull the person to the guard, but he was never jumping.
Never jumping.
Correct. Even the posture standing up, when you start the match in BJJ, they put the head forward, which are very exposed to strikes, right? The position is one that is very dangerous.
Now, I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah, because I think there's something that happened recently with a visitor of ours. Many of our friends don't know because we focus so much in the self-defense aspect of jiu-jitsu, right, the approach. But we often help friends of ours and fighters that come to us for consulting, right, before fights. And one of them was a very prominent female BJJ champion, one of the best ever. And she was preparing for her debut in MMA, and she shared something with you, the confusion of trying to mix. We have mentioned this, I think, before, but I think it would be worthwhile mentioning that.
Yes, just the difficulty of now having to think about strikes. Exactly what we mentioned, that when you now you're used to your whole life practicing without strikes and using techniques very effectively.
But in regards to the posture, because you mentioned the posture of BJJ, and as she was trying to develop herself for the MMA fight, practice for the MMA fight, she was training with wrestlers who would tell her.
Oh yes, I know what you're asking. She said, it's very difficult for me because when I train with a wrestling coach, the wrestling coach tells me to stand one way. When I train with a kickboxing coach, he wants me to stand a different way. So I'm confused. I don't know if I use the kickboxing posture or the wrestling posture. So that also creates some confusion many times for different fighters.
Please, Joaquim.
So the question that I have is this. Wrestling doesn't involve strikes, but we saw superiority of wrestling nowadays in success, and we've spoken about the reasons of why wrestling has succeeded. Do you think
I have a few more.
Okay, and we can talk more about those, but do you think that there is a reason why the adaptation of the art of wrestling, of the sport of wrestling, right, is easier than the adaptation for the lack of strikes in jiu-jitsu for MMA?
Yes.
And then I'm just gonna maybe influence you in a direction of your answer. Would you say that jiu-jitsu is a more complex, sport, if we're talking about BJJ, than wrestling, and the reflexes developed in jiu-jitsu could possibly be harder, to break away from, compared to wrestling, where it's focused more on positions?
No, I believe the reason is what you said earlier. I think that wrestlers, they fight very hard to never have their backs on the ground because that's how they lose. So it's all about being on top. And when you're on top, you don't really need much adaptation because you're not at risk of getting hit. So a wrestler's usually on top, and they're very good at getting on top. Jiu-Jitsu, on the other hand, fights a lot from the bottom, from the back. And so that's where it doesn't really mix.
Yeah, that's what I meant by
Yeah,
complex and simple,
I'll-
right? Wrestling has more of a simplistic approach of just positions, and you're trying to dominate that top position.
Yeah, and then I would say this, what you also said earlier. People might say, well, so then wrestling is better. No, because when you're fighting somebody much bigger and stronger than you, you might not have a
Correct.
chance to be on top. But in the UFC, since they're weight divisions,
That's what Joaquim mentioned.
Correct.
In BJJ now, there are also weight divisions, and that's the same problem. Because of the pin rule, which in Jiu-Jitsu also exists to some extent, because it is the point for the points that you get for passing someone's guard or for mounting, what happens? And there's no penalty to exposing your back, right? So the Jiu-Jitsu practitioners that 40 years ago would consider exposing their backs heresy now do it, just like judo practitioners and wrestlers.
Correct.
And that point is very important. And that's when we have to stress still the difference between MMA, which is the closest it gets among all the combat sports, but it's still very far away from the reality of a street fight.
yes, because even in MMA,
If
when
a
you
s-
turn your back,
Yeah, but to make the point, if a small MMA fighter with a BJJ background, with a wrestling background, who knows very powerful strikes, if he gets on the bottom of a much bigger and stronger layman, and his only option to escape is to explode out, exposing his back, it goes back to what our Grandmaster Edu Gracie used to say. One good hammer fist to the back of the neck will knock you out.
but it's illegal in MMA.
But it's illegal in MMA.
Correct. So it's easier to expose the back because the guy cannot hit your spine.
And it's very important for us, if your objective is to learn self-defense, it's a key reminder. All combat sports, for obvious reasons, for safety reasons, do not allow strikes to the back of the neck. Even boxing, kickboxing.
Yes.
So, and that's the dilemma, right? With tournament training. If your only objective is to win tournaments, who cares about practicing something that is not legal? If it's not legal, I'll take advantage of it. So you have to spar, you have to train competitively, which doesn't mean that you have to think about medals and tournaments, but you have to train that always thinking about the worst case scenarios.
Yes. The unpredictability factor in a chaotic
Yeah.
sparring situation is very important.
And now it's also important to remind our friends that when you do that, it hurts you when you're preparing for a tournament. Because instead of not getting points scored, you might have to allow somebody to score points.
No, for example, you have your
but
legs.
you're not getting knocked out.
You have your legs crossed. The guy stands up. Keeping your legs crossed is going to make it more difficult for them to pass the guard. If there's 30 seconds left, if you open, he might pass your guard.
So you just keep it.
You just keep it
Those
crossed.
are the loopholes that
So you're developing bad
mentioned
habits.
that expose the holes, right, of Jiu-Jitsu today, BJJ today, and wrestling and judo. The same happened with judo.
Yes.
Right? This happened with judo. And I think maybe, Pedro, you can just remind us a bit about that. How was the rivalry between Jiu-Jitsu practitioners up to the 1970s and early 80s and judokas? How did a match, right, a little challenge match, usually end up between a jiu-jitsu practitioner and a judo practitioner?
The judo practitioner on the ground always turned the back because of the pin rule. So you can look at any judo match. It's very common to see the judo person go into a prone position and just protect the neck and wait for the referee to say mate, which means stop, and start standing up again. And so that was the difference between jiu-jitsu and judo on the ground when it came to ground grappling. Judo turned the back and jiu-jitsu didn't. But then because of the point system, jiu-jitsu practitioners started to turn the back as well. And one thing that is important for us to make clear, because every time we have these discussions, people always say, well, but Are you saying that an MMA fighter is not going to be able to defend himself in the street? A BJJ champion is not going to be able to defend himself in the street? Firstly, we must make clear that we're not talking about people, we're talking about skills. Any person who is tough might be able to win a street fight. Might, depending on the situations, right? And rugby players are going to have a better chance in a fight than somebody who doesn't play rugby. Does that mean rugby is self-defense? Just because somebody is athletic, it doesn't mean that the skill that they're learning is good for self-defense. And so athletes, yes, might be able to defend themselves in a street fight, but they also might get surprised because they don't have the training to defend surprise attacks. So they might take a sucker punch to the chin and that might knock them out. And then the fight is over. Or even a stab with a knife. So it's important that we make that very clear. It's not about the individual fighter who might be very strong and athletic and might be able to survive a street fight or even win a street fight. It's about the skills that you're learning. What are the best skills that will prepare you for self-defense? Is learning BJJ, learning different strategies from the guard that completely expose your face in a fight. Is that good for self-defense? How can it be?
I agree. But we're talking about the UFC and what are the best martial arts.
But UFC, and that's what you said earlier, when it comes to combat sports, the one that is most similar to a street fight is MMA. And so the same reason why people don't, why a sport guard is not working in MMA is the same reason why it wouldn't work in a self-defense situation.
Well, but I don't believe there's a martial art called MMA, right? Even though now many people train MMA, but it's
still a mixture, right?
These training protocols are still, yes, it's still mixed. Like you mentioned, that was what I was looking for when I asked you about our friend who was preparing and was telling us that the wrestling coach would say something, the jiu-jitsu coach would say something else, the striker would say something even completely more different. So, but there's one art, and that recently it has been proven to be, if not the most dominant one, it's really up there, which is which one?
In MMA?
Yeah.
Wrestling. That's what we discussed earlier.
No. What is the art
That
is
is what?
now taking over? Many fighters are coming from that background.
Kickboxing?
Sambo.
Sambo.
Combat Sambo.
Oh, sure, yeah, from Eastern Europe.
So why? And it's jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
Sambo, our Sambo friends might not agree entirely, but Sambo is, the origin of Sambo is
It's Russian Jiu-Jitsu.
heavily based.
It's Russian Jiu-Jitsu. The same way you have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which had influences in Brazil.
Striking influences.
Sambo also had influences in Russia. But it is Jiu-Jitsu. That's undeniable. Just look.
Now,
they even wear a kimono. Come on.
What Combat Sambo did and their advantage, as Joaquim said, right? Combat Sambo. Talk to us a little bit about Combat Sambo.
I think it's basically maintaining the idea that striking is part of a fight, right? So, and I think it wasn't that it was by coincidence. I think this was thought about. Look, some people want to practice this more as a sport. Or I shouldn't say more as a sport because it's also a sport, but some people want to practice this without strikes. So let's make sure that we have one that involves strikes so that we don't lose the ability to deal with strikes in a fight.
Yeah. So you have several champions
coming from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And in Brazil,
from Russia.
And in Brazil, the striking elements of jiu-jitsu were pretty much abandoned.
Correct.
Which created a weakness, which I think is part of the answer to your original question of this podcast.
Good. Any final comments? So we're now very open to questions. We're also going to have some guests in our next episodes, but we're really enjoying this interaction with all of our students and friends. So if you have any questions and any topics that you would like us to discuss, please send it via comments, and don't forget to like this video and to support us in all of the social media platforms. Thank you very much.